Welcome everyone. Today's speaker is Caroline Moosmüller, and she will be talking about trajectory inference in Wasserstein spaces. Take it away.
Okay, thanks a lot for inviting me. Happy to be here. Also, I want to mention I just turned off my video in case there's any issues with Wi-Fi connection, so I don't use all of the bandwidth for my video. So this talk is about basically the Wasserstein space. So this is the connection to the algebraic topology part of this seminar. However, the whole talk will be more geometric. So it's about trajectory inference. I will let you know in a second what that exactly means. I just want to mention that this is joint work with my PhD student, Amartya, and two colleagues, Harlin and Nir Sharon. Okay, so let me show you the overview of my talk. So first I will introduce what trajectory inference means and talk about how this problem has been started in the past and what we're going to do differently. And in particular, as you can see in the background of these nodes, it's going to be related to optimal transport, which is almost always the case when you talk about the Wasserstein space. And I will also talk about prior work and then introduce the method that we developed. We call the Wasserstein-Lane-Riesenfeld algorithm, because it's a combination of all of these things. So in case you know the Lane-Riesenfeld algorithm, you will not be surprised about what the method is that I will propose. Okay, so let me talk about the introduction and the type of problem we're trying to solve. So basically what you should think about is point clouds evolving over time. So in every time step, so the time axis is at the bottom, so T0 until Tn. In every time step, discrete time step, you observe a different point cloud. And by point cloud, I mean that every individual particle looks exactly the same to any other particle. So they're all the same. You cannot distinguish between them. And therefore, it's impossible to figure out how each individual particle has moved over time, because every time step, you don't know what happened the time step before to each individual particle. So that's somehow the problem, right? If all of the particles would look different, we could just trace them over time and figure out what happened. But now, since they all look the same, what we want to do is figure out what is the most likely path of all of these particles. And in case you've been to SciM, Mathematics of Data Science, in mid-October, Couturi gave a very nice introduction of this problem, where he basically said, imagine all of these particles moving over time, and they are in the dark, and then only at discrete time steps you turn on the light and you see them, and you want to figure out what happened in between. Okay, so what are the most likely paths that these particles took? So here I'm just drawing, random things. And, basically the problem is not solvable in that sense. There's a lot of different, possibilities. And, as I drew them, it might not be the best in some sense, because particles are not taking the path with the least cost in the sense of optimal transport. So we're going to exploit optimal transport to figure out what happened in between. Okay, so the setup is the following. You have time evolving measures. So the space P sub P is the space of all measures with finite pth moments supported on Rn. And then you observe finite amount of time steps. And they are ordered in time, right? So you have a time ordering. And then the question is, find a curve, so continuous time parameter, that either interpolates the given measures or approximates them. So approximate in the sense that they are close in some distance, for example, the Wasserstein distance. And this, so the relation to what I just talked about, point clouds are finite samples of measures, right? So what I'm describing, the math problem, is a smooth problem, and what I'm plotting is the discrete version of the problem. Okay, so basically this is an interpolation problem, right? Interpolation or approximation problem, which is something that people have done for a very long time, maybe not in the space of probability measures, but in the Euclidean space. And a method that is very well known and very much liked is anything that has to do with splines, right? So splines can be used for approximating, for example, B-splines or something like that. And this is actually the idea we're going to exploit. So the difficulty here is that the space in which our data lies is nonlinear, and it's infinite dimensional. If this was, a regular problem on Rn, there would be a solution for that. Okay, so what we're going to propose, and this is what I will talk about, is an algorithm or a numerical scheme that infers such trajectories that is based on B-splines, like what you would be doing in Rn. And the important thing somehow is, so the important thing, or the selling point for our algorithm is, first of all, it's going to be intrinsic to the Wasserstein geometry, so we're not going to leave the manifold. The other thing is, sometimes in these Wasserstein setups, the particles have different amount of mass, right? So you could imagine these individual particles all having different amount of mass instead of all being uniform. And this is something we can actually deal with naturally through our algorithm. I will show you later. I will show you some plots later, which is something that people have not been able to do before. Okay, so this is the general problem setup. I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions at this point, let me know. And yeah, if not, I will move on. Okay, so let me move on. This is a motivation for the problem we are doing. So if you're familiar with this work, Schiebinger et al., you might also be familiar with what I'm talking about. If not, it's a paper I would recommend. So basically what they're doing is they want to understand the evolution of cells in gene expression space. So if, for example, you have a lot of single cells from a sample you took, and then you do something to those single cells. For example, you apply a drug or something, and you want to see how, what happens to the cells. And so you want to study the evolution over time. The problem is, whenever you take a measurement of a single cell, you will destroy the cell. So in the next time step, you cannot follow the cell you just measured. You can just follow the other cells, right? Its neighbors, for example. So this is basically the setup I just talked about. You have individual single cells, you take measurements, the cell die, but you can follow the rest of the cells. And this is one plot of this from this Schiebinger paper, where they're starting from a particular type of cell and they want to see what happens over time. So for example, cell reprogramming and something like that. Okay, so this is a motivation for the problem. I mean, particles is a motivation too, but this is like a biological motivation. Yeah, let's jump into optimal transport. So as I said before, and whenever you talk about measures of particles, optimal transport is like the natural way to think about this space or the geometry of that space. So let me quickly introduce it. I guess most of you have seen this before. If you study algebraic topology, this might be familiar, but I will just quickly talk about the idea. So this is a way to think about the geometry of the space of measures. So here the two measures are in this plot are mu and nu, and optimal transport finds the best way or the cheapest way to move mu into nu. And the best or cheapest way is defined with this optimization problem that you see in the middle, which says, I'm going to take a function t that moves mu into nu, and I want the overall work the function does to be minimal. And the way I'm measuring that is, how am I moving the mass? So this is t of x minus x, and then multiplied with the amount of mass I'm moving. So the way times the mass. And I'm integrating of the entire space to have like the global work. So this is the smooth problem. And what we get out of this, so if we're able to solve it, which is not always the case, we would get a map that moves one measure into the other, and we would get a distance, which is the Wasserstein distance, the WP, which measures the cost of the movement of this map. And yeah, so there's one parameter I should mention, which is the P. This is, measures with P finite moment. We can define the Wasserstein P distance. All of the plots I'm going to show you later will be in the Wasserstein 2 distance. And on the right side, the plot is the discrete version of that, right? So you have two measures, or in this case, point clouds. One is red, one is blue, and you want to find the matching between those two, or the mapping, the T, that moves alpha into beta in the most cost-efficient way. And I think if you had to draw the right matching, you might have just done what you see here, right? So this is very natural in some sense. Okay, so I wrote down this version of the Wasserstein distance. It's called the Monge version, because this is what we're going to need for, not for the plots and the algorithm, but for the theory. As I said, this does not always have a solution, but if you make regularity assumptions on mu and nu, we would get a solution. And it might also be unique up to an additive constant to the transport map, which is the gradient of a convex function. Great. So there's also another version of this problem, which is called the Kantorowicz version. And I think I have one slide just quickly introducing that. Yeah, so I just wrote the discrete version because this is what we're going to need. It's the same problem, but now imagine that your mass is not uniform, like in the plot on the left, and you would want the mass to split while you're transporting it. This notion does not make sense for a function, because for a function, every point is mapped to exactly one other point, right? So you cannot move one point to two other points. But if you want to split mass, this is exactly what you're doing, right? So the notion of the Monge formulation doesn't make sense here. But we can think about the Kantorowicz formulation, which looks for a coupling matrix rather than a function, or a coupling in a smooth sense exists as well. And basically, we're solving this problem below. So this is the minimization problem. It's the same as before. Instead of an integral, we have a sum. Instead of the tx minus x, we have c, which is the cost matrix. And then we're trying to find the p, the coupling matrix that minimizes the overall cost of moving. Okay, so this problem has a solution. And we're going to use as cost function just the Euclidean distance as we did before. So whenever you see plots later, we solve the discrete version. When we talk about the theory, we actually use the Monge map. So there's some regularity assumptions. Just mentioning so you know. Okay, so this is optimal transport. So basically what you need to know is we have two measures. There's a distance between them. If they're regular, there's a map. If they're not regular, there's a coupling. And this whole thing gives you geometry of the space. So there's much more than just a distance. You can do Riemannian type geometry, which is not something we're going to do. I'm just mentioning there's a whole setup for all of that. But what we need is geodesics. So this is what I'm going to talk about next. It's one slide, so it's not a lot. So what is a geodesic between two measures? So if you look at the bottom plot, what we're doing on the left, let's look at the left picture first. You have this blue Gaussian on the very left, and then you have a red Gaussian on the right. And we want to move the blue into the red in a reasonable way. So the only difference between them is the height, basically, right? And maybe also the width, but it's both Gaussians. So the left plot shows the Wasserstein geodesic. So it's the shortest path in the sense of Wasserstein geometry. And basically what happens is the blue Gaussian just shrinks down and gets a little bit wider to become the red Gaussian, which is very natural in some sense. And this can be compared with using Euclidean geometry, which is the right plot, where one bump would go down while on the other side, the other bump goes up. So it's another way to think about a path between the two Gaussians. But somehow geometry-wise, the natural one would be the left one in Wasserstein geometry. Okay, so how do I get this geodesic? It's actually quite simple. So if you look at the top equation, what it says is you take your two measures, you compute the optimal transport map, which is the t in the middle, and then you just take a linear interpolant in the function space, right? It's 1 minus t identity plus t optimal transport map. It's just a straight line in the function space. And then you take this straight line and push the original measure with. And if t is equal to 0, you will get the original measure. And if t is equal to 1, you will get the other measure. And in between, you get the smooth collection of measures which represented the geodesic in Wasserstein geometry. The reason I call this OT F is because we're going to need the notation later. This is what it means is optimal transport average. So if you fix a t, for example, 1/2, this is a way of getting the midpoint between the two measures, right? As you would do in a linear space, you would just evaluate a t is equal to 1/2 and you get the midpoint. And here, similarly, for any t, it's an average weighted by t. And this is the notation we're going to need later. Okay, in the discrete setting, the way you get this optimal transport geodesic or average is by taking the two discrete measures, the point clouds, computing the optimal coupling, the matching, or one matching, it's not unique necessarily. And then take the straight line, all of the straight lines between the locations of the point clouds, but only those which are non-zero are weighted by the coupling. So the delta notation means the Dirac delta, right? So basically it's the straight lines between all locations of the point clouds, but if the p is 0, it doesn't count, right? So we only connect in those where there's actually a coupling between the masses. Okay, so this is the notion of geodesics, or midpoints, and this is something to keep in mind, and basically that's the only thing we need for our algorithm. So it's very simple, as you will see in a second. Okay, so let's come back to trajectory inference. So as I said, we want to interpolate between point clouds. We're going to use the optimal transport theory to do that, and this idea is not new. So people have done this before, and I will highlight later what the benefit of our algorithm is and what we can do that others cannot. But let me introduce, well, actually two papers only, which basically were the main motivation for what we are doing. Okay, so this is just an overview to show you that many people have worked on that. And you can think about this kind of problem as three different ideas that float around. So the first one is using splines and approximations, which is basically what we are doing. The second one is to use neural nets to match the point clouds. And then there's a couple of other ones, which is usually connected to either Schrödinger bridges or something like that. So I will focus on the first part of the splines and approximation because that's what we're doing. But I just want to mention there's a lot of papers out there trying to do similar things. Okay, so let me talk about two papers, the first two. One we have already mentioned, so this is going back to this cell paper by Schiwinger, which was somehow the first real motivation for doing these problems. So the way they're doing it is actually, it's a nice idea, but also quite simple. Let's say you have 3 point clouds. These are blue, green, and red. Blue is the first in time, green is the second in time, and red is the next in time. So we're going from bottom to top in time. And the way they did their interpolation is as follows. You start in the blue, you compute optimal transport from the blue to the green, and you connect dots based on that. Then you're in the green, you compute optimal transport from green to red, and you connect points by that. And this is the middle plot you can see. It's just these lines, these straight lines, basically. So this is a way to do interpolation. And if you think about it, this is linear interpolation, right? You have 2 points, and you connect it by a line. You stop in this point, you go to the next point, you connect by a line. So it's linear interpolation in the space of measures. And this is how they do all of this, the cell interpolation and stuff like that. So it's easy in some sense, and it's the fastest method, because we're going to do it a little bit more complicated. The reason we're doing it more complicated is because one thing that this method cannot do is infer smooth trajectories, right? So if you think about it, it's linear. So it's not going to produce a smooth curve. There will be corners in some sense, as you can see in the picture. So one question would be, how can we make this into a smooth setting? Or how can we make smooth trajectories? And there's one nice paper, which is very much related to what we are doing, by Sinu Chui and others. And I'm going to introduce this idea quickly. It's not very complicated, but it's very much related to what we're doing. So here, so I made it super simple, so it's easy to follow. In every time step, we only have 2 points. Okay, so the point cloud only depends on 2 points. And so time goes from left to right, and the 2 points move. Okay, so what does this method do? It wants to infer in between points, or trajectories between points. So first, what it does is compute optimal transport from one to the next, like the paper I just talked about, right? So basically connect the points. And this is the most natural. If you think about it, how would you think that these points were moving? Well, the lower points move together, the upper points move together. That makes total sense, right? So this is optimal transport computed between those points. And now they're saying, well, we have this nice, combination of all of these points. Let's fit a smooth spline. So that's exactly what they did. Fit a smooth spline between all of them, and then you get your trajectories which are smooth. And you can do any spline you want, right? Any degree, can be interpolatory, cannot be interpolatory, and you can just forget about the outer part. So basically it's saying, let's use optimal transport to give this linear structure and then fit a spline. Okay, so the good thing about this, it's super fast because you only need to compute optimal transport from one time step to the next, which is the costly part. I haven't mentioned before, but I guess you might be familiar that computing optimal transport is a little bit expensive. And then once you have that, fit the smooth spline, which is quite cheap if you use an iterative algorithm, for example. However, there's two drawbacks to the method. One is it cannot handle mass splitting, as I mentioned before. So let's say you don't have uniform point masses, but the masses change over time, and you might need optimal transport to split two. Then this method doesn't work because it needs this linear structure between individual points, so the lines cannot split somehow. And the other drawback is that it depends on splines in Rn. So the fact that we can do splines depends on the fact that the point clouds are supported, in this case on R2. All the applications I will talk about have the same support space, which is R2 or Rn. But in theory, optimal transport can also works on other support spaces, like some manifolds or something like that. And our method would extend easily to that. We haven't done it, but there's no real problem in doing that. While here you really need splines on Rn. Okay, so that's all the preview. Now I want to talk about the actual method that we are proposing. So any questions at this point? Okay, looks like we're doing great. So let me talk about the Wasserstein-Lane-Riesenfeld algorithm, which is what we're proposing. If you have ever heard about Lane-Riesenfeld algorithm, it will not be surprising to what I'm going to do now. It's a very nice and simple idea. Okay, so this is an introduction to the Lane-Riesenfeld algorithm. So now this slide is not about point clouds, okay? Forget about point clouds for just 1 second. Every point here is just a regular point on Rn. Okay, so how does the algorithm work? It's basically an algorithm that produces B-splines on Rn. And it's an iterative algorithm. So you can decide the degree, m, so the degree of your B-spline, and you can decide how well you want to approximate it, which is the refinement level. So the result is going to be, as the refinement level goes to infinity, we will achieve the B-spline. So it's an iterative scheme. Okay, how does it work? So let's start on the left. We are given 4 points which lie on the corners of a square, and they are ordered in time, right? So in this case, I think it goes from top left to top right and then down. And what we want to do is we want to fit a B-spline to those 4 points. And we're going to do the corner cutting scheme, which means B-spline of degree 2. And what we're going to get in the limit is basically a circle that sits in this square, which approximates the points. Okay, so the way it works is it has 2 steps. First step is the doubling point step, and the second step is the averaging step. So first step is double points, which you can see in the left picture. And then we take averages between consecutive points, basically. So we keep the corners because of the doubling, and we insert midpoints. And then, picture C, we again do averages, right? So you can see the brighter points are the midpoints, basically, and the less bright points are the ones from before. throw away the ones from before and connect the new midpoints. This is step D. And as you can see, the square has become a more refined square, right? And now the algorithm repeats. So double points, compute midpoints again, throw away the odd points, and you will get something which is more circular. Do this infinitely many times, you will get a circle. This is the algorithm. So here's just a very short code that explains how that works. So you have your input data, you decide what degree you want, you decide what refinement level you want, you do a doubling step, and then you do as many averaging steps as you need. And that's it. Great. So if you look at that, and you want to do the same thing in Wasserstein space, it's fairly easy, right? The only thing you do is doubling, which just means double the measure or the point cloud. And the other thing is averaging, which means compute a midpoint. Well, I just introduced the geodesics, right? Which give us a way to compute midpoints between point clouds. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So here's the algorithm for the Wasserstein geometry. So if you look at the left plot, the darker colors are the given point clouds, in this case, Gaussians. So you have a black Gaussian, then you have a dark red Gaussian, lighter red Gaussian, orange Gaussian. And the question is, what are the in-between smooth B-spline trajectories? The output of our algorithm is the picture on the very right. And you can see it looks nice, right? It's trajectories, they are smooth, they interpolate the points. And in some sense, they are a version of B-splines in Wasserstein space. Well, how did we get there? The algorithm is like the one before. In every step, we fill in between points. We cut off corners, but now each data point is a point cloud itself, right? So if you look at how the images evolve from left to right, the points get denser and denser. So we're not really tracing our trajectories, we're just computing in between point clouds. And as we do this many times, it visually looks like a trajectory or many trajectories. Okay, how does the algorithm work? Well, the same thing as before. Take your point clouds, double them, which just means store a copy, and then compute the optimal transport average, compute the midpoint in optimal transport sense. And then, repeat as often as you want. So the number of, so the degree of the B-spline, which was M before, is somehow the smoothness degree, right? So the smoother you want your B-spline, the higher you need the degree, is how often you have to do averaging. So this is the M parameter. And then you have to reiterate the whole process, R times to get refinement R. So in the plots I'm showing you on this slide, we are using degree 2, and we're doing, I think, 5 or 6 refinements. And this already gives you very nice, visually nice looking curves. Okay, that's it. That's the algorithm. It's very simple.
I have a question here.
Yes.
Namely, when you defined the average, you said something like that the optimal transport map doesn't need to be unique. So that means the geodesics are not unique, right? So what do you do in cases where it's not unique?
Yeah, so it's not unique. We need just any coupling. It doesn't matter which one. We just need a coupling that does the job. And it will, in the setting I'm showing you right now, there's no problem. There's always an optimal transport map. I will show you later another setting where there's no optimal transport map, but it still looks nice. So the only thing we need to require is it couples the 2 point clouds, but it doesn't matter how it couples.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, great question. Yeah, so that's the algorithm. Let me show you some pictures to make sure I convince you that this is a nice idea. I will only say one thing. It can become computationally expensive if you do a lot of refinement. So if you want them to be very smooth in some sense, I'm not saying mathematically smooth because we haven't proved anything, but visually smooth, you need a lot of refinements, and M has to be large. And then you have to do a lot of optimal transport computations, which is expensive. But to do this, what I'm just showing you now, degree 2 is fine. Okay, so just very simple edge cases. if you have 2 point clouds, so just 2 time steps, T0, T1, which is the left plot. And if you do our algorithm, what you will get back is exactly the optimal transport matching. So if there's only 2 point clouds, it will uncover optimal transport. Similarly, if each point cloud is just 1 point, we are back on the regular interpolation problem on Rn. This is the right plot. Then our algorithm will just recover the regular spline. So this is really an extension of what exists already, right? So the one case where it's just 2 point clouds, it's optimal transport. The other case where each point cloud is just 1 point, it's a spline. Okay, so here's the trajectory splitting and non-uniform mass I talked about. So here we have 40 point clouds in time. Left is the black one, then we have 2 dots in the middle and then 6 outside. So this is, time goes from left to right, basically. And as we move the 2 points in the middle from inside to outside, so these are 3 different versions of the same thing, you can see that the trajectories bend towards them, which makes sense because we're trying to include those masses. But also you can see that the trajectories are splitting. This is natural because we start with 1 mass and we end with 6 masses. So in order to get from 1 to 6, we naturally have to split, right? Otherwise, there's no way to get the mass from one to the other. So there's no map, right? But there is a coupling, or there are multiple couplings. And as you can see, it looks very smooth in some sense, right? All of the mass first goes into 2 directions, and then at some point it splits. And the splitting looks smooth in some sense. Okay, and similarly, same problem, but now in the middle time step, the mass is non-uniform. So the lower point has more mass to it. And as you can see, more trajectories are bending towards this mass point because they have to fulfill the fact that more mass is going down. So all of this is very natural in some sense. I'm not saying that this is a realistic problem, but it looks realistic in the sense that it does what we would expect it to do. Okay, so this is special cases somehow. Let me show you some toy examples that people like. So the top example is, I don't know what the name was. I think it's just pedal or something. Basically, time goes from inside to outside, right? So you start inside in the black dots and then you go to the orange ones. So the left one, the left picture, which doesn't really, doesn't do the best job of interpolating the data, is a neural network version. Our algorithm is on the right, and the middle one is this other spline algorithm. It works in this case because all the points are uniform, so there's no problem. And if you look at it, it looks exactly like our method. So if we have uniform mass, those 2 algorithms are essentially the same because they're both doing splines. However, in the plot below, the mass is non-uniform. So if you do the neural net version on the left, it doesn't really match the mass distribution. The middle one is a spline version with Fisher-Rao geometry, which is similar to the one on the top. And they also came up with this data set, which is somehow a little bit unnatural because if you look at it closely, trajectories intersect in the middle and then move out again. However, if you look at our method, it naturally evolves from left to right, right? So the mass flows and then it splits, as one would probably expect. Okay, so one thing you can see from the method, especially in this picture, is it's not interpolatory, right? We're doing B-splines or splines, which do not interpolate. This is a very big table, which I don't think I will talk about. Basically, what it says is we compare to many data sets, and most of the times we are pretty competitive in the sense of time and in the sense of approximation. But this is maybe not the best thing to show in a talk. Let me show you something else. This is an interpolatory scheme. So what I talked about before is Wasserstein-Lane-Riesenfeld, which basically uses the Lane-Riesenfeld algorithm with Wasserstein averaging. But you can use any other scheme like that, and they exist millions, with just doing optimal transport averaging. So for example, here's another scheme which is called the 4-point scheme, which does interpolation. And here the point clouds move in time around the circle. So these are Gaussians that move in time around the circle, and the Gaussians are non-uniform, as you can see, right? So the mass is non-uniformly distributed in every step. And this is our algorithm using the 4-point scheme. So basically, same kind of idea using optimal transport averages, but a different iterative scheme. And you can see it nicely interpolates, and it also moves the mass in a reasonable sense. Okay, yeah, before I get there, so my talk is basically done. Okay, and I think I'm good in time. I have one slide that says the whole thing converges, and then I'm basically done. So let me show you the slide. This is maybe notation heavy, but basically what it says is we want to show that if you do the algorithm infinitely many times, so if the refinement goes to infinity, then it will converge to a curve. So how are we showing this? You have point clouds, and we're doing piecewise geodesics between them. This is the NR. So in refinement step R, we are fitting a piecewise geodesic between our point clouds. And then we're showing those piecewise geodesics as R goes to infinity converges to a curve. And this is basically the result. So if you do the piecewise geodesic interpolant in Wasserstein space, it will converge to a curve. And we also have a convergence order, so a convergence rate. So the limit to the rth in refinement level in the Wasserstein distance can be bounded by a constant, which is independent of this refinement times 2 to the minus r. So why 2? Because we are halving in it. We're doing averaging in every step, right? And we're basically using a result. So the proof is not complicated. It's basically a result that exists for regular B-splines done on finite dimensional Riemannian manifolds. The only technical difficulty is that we are not really on a Riemannian manifold, but we have a lot of Riemannian tools, and we are not finite dimensional. But it doesn't really matter for the proof. So the only thing we need is the fact that we have geodesic properties, and we have a complete metric space, and that's it. Okay, so I have proof details, but I don't think I need to go into it. Basically, we're showing it's a Cauchy sequence and then use the fact that the Wasserstein space is complete. And then we get the bound. So again, it's basically using a method that already existed, moving it into the Wasserstein space. And everything carries over, even though we don't have the tools we usually have. Okay, so the summary. We have a new version of trajectory inference in Wasserstein space, extending, theory. What I think the benefit of our method is it's very natural to the geometry. So it does not depend on anything that happens on Rn, really. It only depends on the Wasserstein space. And therefore, we can deal with trajectory splitting in non-uniform mass, which other methods cannot. The method is flexible in the sense that you can decide how much refinement level you want to have, and can be extended to any subdivision scheme, so any refinement scheme that exists, basically. So whatever your favorite iterative scheme is, just replace the averaging with optimal transport, and you will be good. And yeah, here's the preprint, and yeah, that's it. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much. Let's please all unmute ourselves so that we can clap together for the speaker. Great. So we start with the questions. I see there is already a question by Thomas Peters.
Yes, Carolyn, thank you. Sure. Carolyn, thank you for a very nice talk. When you first introduced the convergence, going from the piecewise linear approximations to the spline approximations, they were clearly on simply illustrative examples and looked very nice. But my understanding is this is pointwise convergence. When you got to the more complicated images on your slide 20, I began to wonder about, would this convergence support the right embedding of the final curve or curves? And in some cases, you even mentioned there might be self-intersections, so it might lead to different immersions. And what I'm thinking of course, here is the type of thing that happens with the Alexander Horn sphere or wild arcs, where you have nice things in pointwise convergence that then converge to something that's entirely topologically different. So I'm just, the sort of the overview question here is there any view of, topology preservation between the intervening approximates and the final object to which it converges?
So if I understand this correctly, so one thing I want to say is the middle plot here is not from our algorithm.
Yeah.
Ours is right. So, so we don't have intersections in that sense of the curves. I mean, we could have intersections if it comes from optimal transport. So the algorithm does not change the topology. So we are always in Wasserstein space with the same Wasserstein topology that you impose on it. We will not move from there. So we're always in the same space. The convergence is in the sense of, if I go back, in the sense of functions, really. So it's functions, it's uniform in T. So it's curves that go from whatever interval in T into the Wasserstein space. So we're always going in the same space with the same geometry, same topology, and it's uniform in the time parameter. So that does not change. Does that make any sense to your question? I'm just thinking.
But I'm still concerned that, I agree with the topology of the underlying spaces, but the convergence is in T. So I'm presuming that is pointwise in T. You go to a particular value T and you assess that you have convergence there. And I'm looking more.
No, it's uniform in T. I haven't written it here. I just have the convergence order, but the convergence is uniform in T.
Okay. All right. That may help. Let me think about that a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah, so the formula I have here is just to show the convergence order, but it's for any T. But the convergence itself is uniform in T.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Then Dave, you also have a question?
Yes, you mentioned his motivation at the beginning of your talk, looking at genetic information and cells, where in order to get the genetic information, the cell is destroyed, but you have a population of them you're working with. Have you tried your method on cellular data?
Yes, we have tried it. So this is the table. We have an extended table, but basically the Dingen tree and the Dingen cycle is, so I think the tree is only but I mean, it's still cells. So this is cell data basically, but I think the tree is synthetic and the cycle is not. But we have an extensive section in our paper about trying it on cell data and comparing to all other methods, like neural net methods and other spline methods, and so on. We also have one extension which I think is new in the sense that usually you model cells as uniform points, right? But there's also this notion of supercells where you merge uniform cells together if they're very similar to make one big point cloud. And then the data becomes non-uniform. And we can also infer trajectories in such settings because our method does not need the uniform data. So yes, overall, what I can say is it works on cell data. It's a little bit slower than the other spline method because you have to do more optimal transport computations, but it's approximately the same. The error is approximately same or better. And we usually produce more natural results than neural nets.
Good. So not having the paper in front of us, often you're looking at different populations of cells and you want to see how they evolve over time. Are you able to see the evolution of different populations or, say, cells transforming from one state to another?
Yeah, so this is not something we have looked into. Basically, what we did was take. So we did not do any biological interpretation. That's what basically I'm saying. What we did was take data which already exists, where people already know, what it means and what it does, and just show that we can compete with other methods. However, this is something we are interested in doing. So we have a collaborator in UNC Medical School. Who is interested in understanding the output of different methods applied to cells on whatever the evolution. And this is something we want to study with our methods, hoping that we can see a little bit more because of the smooth trajectories. But yeah, we haven't done that. We have just done basically a baseline test with methods that already existed.
Oh, good. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more questions?
I'll ask a question. So, Carolyn, I missed it. How did you do these algorithms when at two different times you had different masses?
It works exactly the same. So our algorithm does not care about how the mass is distributed. The only thing you need is, the mass sums to 1 in every step. But how it's distributed doesn't matter. Because the only thing you need to do is...
I see, but you do need the mass to sum to 1 at every step.
Yes, or to something constant. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I understood. Thank you.
The only thing we need is there has to be an optimal transport coupling. And if that exists, we can do whatever we want to do.
Right. Thank you.
Nice. Okay, yeah, any more questions? I have one while people are still thinking if they can come up with a question. Namely, yeah, actually, exactly this picture that you have here on the slides. Like the whole talk, I was wondering why you look at B-splines that don't go through the points themselves. And then you showed this site where you said you can actually do that. So then I was wondering, is there any advantage of the approach that you showed before where you don't interpolate through the points compared to this approach with the 4-point scheme?
I guess it depends on what you want to do, right? It's like in regular interpolation approximation. When should you interpolate? When should you approximate? It depends on what you want. For example, the classical example, if you force interpolation, the curves might look very unnatural, right? Because if the points are very
kind of
close,
overfitting.
Yeah, like overfitting problem. So we always did the splines in comparing to other methods, just because they seem to do a good enough job, not interpolating exactly, but still approximating so close that we don't see any issue with that. However, yeah, it's a choice, and you can do whatever fits your problem.
Yeah, perfect.
So I wouldn't say one is better than the other. It's just that we started with splines and then we did interpolation.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the application.
Yeah, for sure. But
great,
from the table, we always did the splines and they did well enough, so we didn't even move to interpolation.
I see. And Thomas has a follow-up question.
I think you're muted.
Muted.
And also, let me try to start my video again. I'm just very worried with the strength of the internet. So let me know if it breaks.
Sure. So this 22 is a very good example of what I was trying to ask before. So you look at this image, and first of all, I'm assuming it's a closed curve. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and I think you mentioned you could have self-intersections or not. And so I also look at this curve and wonder, could this possibly be knotted or not in 3 dimensions? And so is what you're doing address those questions in the sense of, if you know at the end that the truth of the curve that you were interpolating should be knotted or not, does this come out in your method at all?
Sorry, is this about you mean in our method, the curve should not be intersecting?
Yeah, so that's certainly a first way to look at it. And the more complicated aspect is, even if it's not self-intersecting, could it be knotted when it should be, or shouldn't?
Oh, okay, I see. So I think the reason here it's self-intersecting is because we're using the W2 geometry, in which case this happens naturally. If you move to the W1 geometry, I think you would not be seeing the intersections, though I haven't tried it. I think your question is about individual trajectories, while the curve we are getting is going from Rn to the space of measures, right? Yeah. So it's the the collection of trajectories is the curve. right?
Fair
So
enough.
it's we don't have a proof about individual curves. So we don't know how they, how they relate to each other. Our proof says if you have smooth measures, so not point clouds, but smooth, and you look at the curve that goes from the real line into the space of probability measures, then we have uniform convergence. But we don't have a statement about the individual trajectories.
Okay,
Just
and you don't have also any prior knowledge of what those individual trajectories should be.
Well, in these examples, we don't.
Okay.
But what you're referring to is, let's say, assume we have a curve where each individual trajectory is not intersecting, will reproduce that.
Yes.
And this I don't know.
And what?
This is something I don't know.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, because we have not studied individual trajectories. We just studied the collection.
Okay,
But
thanks very much.
I think if you try W1 geometry, you might end up with something non-intersecting.
Okay. Thank you.
Great, we've had some great questions. I think this is probably all the questions we had. So then I'll stop the recording here. And before that, I want to thank you again for the great talk.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me.